Thank you, Speaker.
Sen.Sige, you have a balance of 59 minutes.
Thank you, Speaker. I beg to move that the Persons with Disabilities Bill 2023, Senate Bill 7 of 2023, be read a second time. Speaker, history tells us the story of a poor, young, blind Kenyan man from makwiny named John Kimuyu, who in 1959, at 26 years old, defied age, race, and disability to court and soon after marry Ruth Holloway, a very well-off 35-year-old white missionary woman from Nottingham, England, who was his teacher at the school for the disabled at the time that he attended. Needless to say, Speaker, the union in 1959 was unfathomable. Amid segregation and high tensions around British colonialism, this was the backdrop to which their story progressed, attracting much opposition from the British community because of his race, of course, but also because of the disdain for Mr. Kimuyu's disability. In response, this also saw Kenyans with disabilities take to the streets in protest of this discrimination. Although black men, including Mzee Jomo Kenyatta and Agwing Skodek, had both freely married white women themselves, protesters demanded that Mzee Kenyatta protect the inherent right of PWDs and their right to marry freely. And that, Speaker, is where the arduous journey of disability inclusion began. Speaker, it is said that love is blind, and perhaps it is. But I would go further to say that disability is blind. Blind because disability does not discriminate. People do. Blind because disability does not discriminate. Systems do. Blind because it has been repeatedly ignored, rendering us invisible. Blind because in 1959, the young, determined, blind man did his part to expose a problem, giving me, today, a young, determined, blind woman, the opportunity to do my part and propose solutions. The principal object of this PWD bill is to repeal the Persons with Disabilities Act of 2003 and have in place a law that is consistent with our Constitution. The bill places emphasis on human rights approach towards the realization of rights for persons with disabilities. The bill also sets out the obligations of both the national and county governments in line with the Constitution of 2010 to ensure that the county obligations are delineated towards the fourth schedule of the Constitution. The bill also incorporates the provisions of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, as well as the Protocol to African Charter on Human Rights. Speaker, currently there is no legal framework that sets out the obligations of the county governments with regard to persons with disabilities, that is. This bill, therefore, seeks to impose obligations on each level of government to address the needs of PWDs, in line, of course, with Article 54 of our Constitution. Under this bill, the national government is mandated to, among other functions, develop policies on the protection of persons with disabilities, promote integration of persons with disabilities in education institutions, healthcare, justice systems, also promote the inclusion of PWDs in employment and the public service, and implement preferential procurement measures for PWDs managed by, for entities managed by PWDs. Speaker, the implementation of the above is vital, as it is crucial to avail resources to make it easy for inclusion and integration of PWDs in all services. Let's take the healthcare system, for example. There are cases where a deaf person has gone to a hospital and receives a prescription that says 2 times 3. To you and I, that seems like a very straightforward instruction. Take 2 tablets 3 times a day. But that would be a wrong assumption in this case. That's what we call ableism, Speaker. Without a trained sign language interpreter present to communicate the prescription, this deaf patient calculated simple maths, 2 times 3, and thought that they should take 6 tablets at once. These mistakes can have serious consequences that we cannot ignore. This is just one example of many layered challenges that persons with diverse disabilities face across different sectors on a daily basis. On the other hand, Speaker, county governments are mandated to, among other functions, implement the national policy and strategy on persons with disabilities, which I understand is being drafted by the National Council of Persons with Disabilities as we speak. Allocate adequate resources to programs targeting PWDs, and develop mechanisms for identification and registration of persons with disabilities residing in each county. Speaker, the 2019 census estimated the population of PWDs at around 900,000. This was a sharp reduction in the number of PWDs compared to 10 years prior in 2009 census, recording over 1.3 million PWDs approximately. That left a discrepancy of around 400,000 PWDs. You can see how, Madam Speaker, since census discrepancy can suppress PWD inclusion. An equitable budget allocation as well towards inclusive development. It should be noted that these numbers are not actually broken down into counties. It's a huge gap that needs legislative intervention because, as I like to say, if you don't count it, it doesn't count. However, this bill will bridge this gap. Madam Speaker, I would like to highlight the utmost significance of interagency relations, recognizing that the National Council for Persons with Disabilities, NCPWD, cannot operate effectively in isolation. The officials of NCPWD have brought to this House the difficulties they encounter in fulfilling their responsibilities due to inadequate staffing. In order to address this concern, it's essential for the county governments and admin officers to play a role in identifying PWDs and facilitating their registration across the counties. By working in collaboration, we can alleviate this burden and ensure that support is given to PWDs. The bill seeks to review the membership of National Council for Persons with Disabilities to ensure that the council is more efficient and representative. Madam Speaker, the bill also requires county governments to only approve plans for the construction of roads and buildings that take into account accessibility and universal design provisions. Now, Madam Speaker, the ever-prevalent notion that accessibility is just providing a ramp or a lift is very small-minded. Speaker, without education on universal design, we run the risk of forever believing that being accommodative to PWDs means only building ramps and lifts because, hey, that's all we need to be compliant with. That is wrong. Allow me to take us all into a quick universal design class, Madam Speaker. The built environment should be meticulously designed, constructed, and maintained to facilitate orientation and ensure safety. In my world of inclusive transport and mobility, Speaker, orientation specifically means the ability to navigate, identify potential hazards, and determine when one has reached the destination. For example, when designing pathways, it's crucial to ensure that an adequate width, free from obstacles with a continuous, firm, durable, slip-resistant surface is provided for. Appropriate measures such as universally designed drop curbs, tactile paving, and handrails should also be incorporated to avoid accidents and injuries. to allow for the passage of 2 wheelchair users, a minimum unobstructed width of 1.8 meters is recommended, so that in a fire breakout, sufficient space is provided to prevent casualties. In the case of ramps, they should have a surface width of at least 1.2 meters. Further, both the foot and the head of the sloped path, stepped path, or ramp should have an end landing. It's also important to include guardrails alongside ramps to ensure safety of wheelchair users and pedestrians who require extra support, preventing injuries that may occur during falling. These intricacies are often overlooked by our architects, urban designers, construction companies, and agencies, but are vital in creating truly accessible environments for all to use. Speaker, I experienced a concerning issue in the City Hall building, an institution entrusted with safety of all of us in Kenya, including PWDs. For a period of time, the building had no functioning lifts, resulting in restricted access for PWDs and other individuals with limited mobility, like the elderly, attempting to reach specific offices on various floors. If City Hall, an entity whose needs to lead by example, fails to uphold these requirements, how can we expect that other institutions to comply? Speaker, persons with disabilities want and need to access City Hall, courthouses, police stations, huduma centers, education institutions, sporting venues, houses of worship, malls and supermarkets, cinemas and museums, cafes and restaurants, and even bars and nightclubs. It may be hard to believe, Speaker, but we don't only visit hospitals and therapy facilities as PWDs. We have a life and we want to live it as fully as we can. In order to align the functions of the Council with the Constitution of Kenya, this bill proposes to enhance the powers and functions of the National Council for Persons with Disabilities by including functions that require the Council to liaise and consult with county governments and other relevant agencies. The bill seeks to ensure that county governments are consulted by the ministry responsible for sports as well, when developing designs to make sports facilities accessible to persons with disabilities. We call these adaptive sports facilities, Speaker. Further, in keeping with the current technological developments of the world, the National Council is required to undertake research and recommendations of new tech, including assistive devices, mobility aids, and rehabilitation therapies. Inaccessibility in the built environment affects every part of our experience. The correlation may not be obvious, Speaker, but allow me to explain. As PWDs, inaccessible primary schools mean that we often receive far less adequate early childhood interaction. Inaccessible high schools means that we miss out on the integral adolescent education that we need. And inaccessible university campuses mean that we miss out on the qualifications that we need to be employable. If we manage to withstand all of these barriers, still we battle as adults with inaccessible workplaces, public transport systems and stations, as well as inaccessible essential services, including health and wellness, financial, recreational, cultural, and governmental services. This bill also proposes to deal with the realization of rights and incentives for persons with disabilities. The bill is specific on the following rights, among others: the right to equality and non-discrimination, the right to legal capacity, the right to marry and form a family, the right to human dignity, the right to education, the right to work, and the right to health. The bill provides for incentives and reliefs, including tax exemptions, incentives for local manufacturers of assistive devices, access to credit, exemption to taxable income if you're an employer person with disability, and exemption from postal charges. The bill makes provisions against harmful practices, torture, and cruel treatment against PWDs, providing for life imprisonment on conviction. The bill also amends the Films and Stage Plays Act to compel makers of film to make such films accessible to people with disabilities, which I personally very much enjoy as a provision. Madam Speaker, we have an obligation to ensure that persons with disabilities are at long last recognized, respected, and included in our society. Building the environment through inclusive development is far more than just development, Speaker. I see it as a common thread that either brings PWDs closer to or further away from the dignity, independence, safety, confidence, equity, and inclusion that we work twice as hard to enjoy every day. To do so, we must pass this bill. It is in this context that this bill proposes to impose obligations on each level of government to address socio-economic needs of PWDs in all areas. Speaker, to conclude, by repealing the PWD Act of 2003 and introducing these comprehensive provisions, we can break free from the shackles of neglect and forge a path of progress. This bill demands our collective action and unwavering determination to transform the status quo. It calls for the national and county governments to assume their responsibilities, ensuring that PWDs are treated with dignity and respect and provided with equal access to education, employment, transportation, and other essential services that all other Kenyans enjoy. Let's challenge ourselves to envision a society where disability is not ignored, but a realm of untapped potential for far-reaching diversity, equity, and inclusion in Kenya. Madam Speaker, at this point, I beg to move and call upon, I'm not sure if my seconder is here behind me because I can't see, but my seconder was Nairobi Senator.
He's not there.
He stepped out. Thank you. I then call upon Senator Cherargei